Good afternoon. Today we have Professor Alan Blinder. He's the Gordon S. Rentschler. You have almost a longer title than mine. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs here at the Woodrow Wilson School. He's going to discuss his new books, After the Music Stopped, The Financial Crisis, The Response, and The Way Ahead. Alan is a true Princetonian. He graduated with the great class of 1967. If you were a group of alums, you would have been and a wunderkind, he became a member of the faculty in 1971. So if you do the math, you know that's really quite short. During his tenure here, he's been chair of the economics department, and he founded Princeton Center for Economic Policy Studies, which is now called the Griswold Center, which he founded in 1990. Alan really embodies those who have combined a stellar academic career with true public service. He served as a member of President Clinton's first Council of Economic Advisors, and then moved on to become chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. His razor-sharp understanding of the academic view of economic policy and the economy, combined with his actual policy experience in Washington, inform his insights on the Great Recession that are reflected in this new book, which I should just highlight he will be signing and selling after the talk. In this book, Alan says in his own words, After the Music Stopped is written for people who really want to understand what happened to us since 2007. I think that defines all of us. It's not a whodunit, but rather why they did it, or why did they do it, and it's about how we got into this mess, what do we do to get out of it, and what remains to be done. This is clearly a very timely talk by a very informed observer, and it's very exciting to have us in here today with us today. Please join me in welcoming Alan Blinder.
Thank you, Cece. When I was asked to give this talk in this particular venue, which is a school of public policy, it was obvious to me which piece of, I hate to say this, 450 or so page book, it's a long book, but of course worth every page, I should talk about. You don't cover 450 pages in a lecture. So as I said, it was easy because I'm going to speak today about how good policy, what I will argue was good policy. By the way, good policy after the crash came. There was a lot of bad policy before, and I may just allude to that a little bit. Good policy after the crash became absolutely wretched politics, and that's what I will call shortly the paradox of macroeconomic policy. That's why this paradox cartoon is on the screen now. Now, just to frame this, since this is about the book, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, this is the table of contents of the book. I was reminded as I looked at this slide that a lot of what's here is chapter 2 and 3, the blue. So when I say the blue chapters, if you open the book, they're not blue, they're black and white. Up here, they're blue. The blue chapters really came out of a lecture I gave in 2008, right here in this room, about some of the things that had gone wrong and why we were in the kind of soup that we look to be in. The red chapters are about the crisis itself, the crash and its aftermath. The green chapters are about the immediate response of the government. So now we're getting into the meat of what I want to talk about as good policy, the talk, the stimulus, the things the Fed did. And this looks like brown. What does it look like to you? Brownish chapters are about the subsequent policy responses. Once we had a little more time, we weren't just putting out fires. I'm going to focus, as you can probably deduce from this outline, on chapter 13. There are bits and pieces that come elsewhere. Chapter 13 is called The Backlash, and it's about exactly what I just said a few moments ago. And then the last chapters of the book are about the present and the future, and I won't touch on those unless there are questions when I'm finished. So here's what I propose to do. Define a little more carefully than I've just done the policy paradox itself. Talk about, document in some sense, the backlash. Talk about the reasons for that backlash, which may be the most important part of this talk from a public policy perspective, and then see what kind of lessons there might be for policymakers the next time something, how shall I say this, terrible but not this terrible happens. I hope nobody in this room, including the young people, if there are any young people, will ever live through a set of economic events as bad as this one. The last one was 70 years plus ago, so I think there's a reasonable. Although if you're young enough, and that's well finished. Okay, so the policy paradox. A bunch of mistakes made in free markets led us to the brink of disaster, or maybe to disaster, I should say. And I alluded to this a moment ago. Those mistakes were aided and abetted, or maybe I should say allowed, by what I think it's not an exaggeration called an abdication of regulatory authority. One of the misconceptions that sometimes goes around about this crisis is that the regulators didn't have the authority they needed to stop it. That is false. They had plenty of authority. They just didn't use it. Then came the policy response, which, as I say here, was huge, multifaceted, and in many respects novel. There was a lot of creativity in this set of policy responses because there was no rule book that you could just, an instruction manual that you look at and say, well, in these circumstances, what do you do? We never had these circumstances before. And for a while, the reaction was pretty favorable towards the state activity. So here's my favorite New Yorker cartoon from the crisis. It was published more or less at the depth of the crisis. And I think you can read that even in the back. I try to make this big. Can you read it in the back? Yeah. This was the attitude. This was the anti-Reagan attitude that flourished in the United States of America for about a month. And that's when it was during that month that the New Yorker published this lovely cartoon. Instead, the reactions to the government's actions were more reminiscent of Howard Beale in the famous movie Network. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. So here's the first bit of audience participation. Who knows who that is? Rick Santelli. So for those of you who don't know Rick Santelli is a very excitable and somewhat right-of-center reporter, commentator on the network CNBC. On February 19th, the day after President Obama announced his mortgage foreclosure mitigation plan, such as it was, in a few minutes I'll say it wasn't much, Rick Santelli got on CBC and in a very excited voice enunciated what came to be called the Rick Santelli rant. This is not my terminology. This is accepted. You can Google it, Rick Santelli rant, and it will turn up quite a few entries. Here are selected words. The government is promoting bad behavior. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? I'm thinking of a mortgage with an extra bathroom. And the rant ends, however, we're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. This is the origin of the Tea Party movement, the Rick Santelli rant. So the policy paradox is that once the crisis became really acute, policymakers took very bold, comprehensive, and I argue effective actions that were very interventionist by American standards. We're not a very interventionist government, despite what you hear from some people. And they were quite effective. Not perfect. Things were improvised on the fly. No one was going to get it perfect. But actually quite well thought out and well executed. The pre-crisis quasi-laissez-faire policies were quite different, and as I was suggesting a few moments ago, constituted a case of malign neglect. So let's try to apply logic to those two bullet points. The intervention was very good. The laissez-faire that preceded the intervention was very bad. So you might think that this would score a point against laissez-faire and a point in favor of policy activism. But as a former president of the United States once said, that would be wrong. Instead, that burst of policy activism plus, of course, the terrible economy that followed, led to a backlash, and that's the subject of today's lecture. Led to a backlash against the Federal Reserve, which in some sense led the charge in fighting the crisis. Led to a backlash against the administration. So that meant for a few months the Bush administration, but quickly it was the Obama administration starting January 2009. Against the Congress in general and against the Democrats in particular, because if you remember, a lot of these major interventions were strongly supported by Democrats and almost uniformly opposed by Republicans. Not all of them, but there was the public could perceive a very clear party difference between the Democrats that wanted to do X, Y, and Z, and the Republicans were saying no, no, no. That was obvious. Against Keynesian economics, I hate to say, but it was true. I'll come back to each of these shortly. And more generally against policy activism, the reverse of that cartoon that we just saw. Political scientists have long known and written that Americans are basically pragmatic liberals but ideological conservatives. That means if you ask them, they tell you conservative things in general, but if you ask them specific things like, how would you like to abolish Social Security? The answer is very uniform, or almost uniform. There are a few diehards, but very few Americans want to abolish Social Security and are truly anti-government, even though if you ask them, if you're an American, you have to be anti-government. That's part of being an American. My favorite example of this came in one of those town hall meetings when the Obamacare debate was going on in the summer of 2009, when a constituent of a North Carolina congressman exclaimed at a town hall, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." I'd like you to think about that just a second. It's one of the most quintessentially American things that were said in this entire debate. And the central question for today is why? And in particular, as I indicated, what can we learn from this episode so that it doesn't happen again? This backlash doesn't happen again, or at least is milder the next time the government has to do extraordinary things. So here is a statement of the backlash by Tim Geithner. We saved the economy, but we kind of lost the public doing it. I think this sentence is exactly right, except I would scratch out, if I was editing this, this is unedited, this is exactly what Geithner said. I would edit out kind of. They lost the public very badly doing it. And the question is why. The mystery is deepened if you look at the facts. So this is a graph of the monthly unemployment losses when the bar is going down, and gains when the bar is going up. It's mostly going down here in the years 2008, 2009, 2010. If I remind you, according to the official arbiter, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the recession ended midway through 2009. So a lot of this is the recession, and then it's the recovery. I've colored in red two events, the inauguration of Barack Obama in January 2009 and the passing of the big fiscal stimulus bill in February 2009. Now, if we use this as a Rorschach test, or a Martian came down, had no idea what had happened in America, and you showed him when Barack Obama became president of the United States, I think this Martian would probably say, wow, he must have been incredibly popular. Which was correct for about his first 2 days in office. And then the popularity started sinking and sinking and sinking. There looks to be a prima facie case here, before you do anything sophisticated, that the stimulus did a lot of good. But unfortunately, for President Obama and more generally for the Democrats, the good actually meant things started deteriorating at a slower rate. Right? Note that all these bars are going down, indicating job losses. So the job losses are dissipating, which makes economists happy, but there's still losses, which doesn't leave the public very happy. The public senses that we're still going downhill, not uphill. And of course, President Obama's political enemies were only too happy to jump on that point. So I listed before the institutions that experience backlash. So let me start with the Fed and one of my favorite posters of the whole thing, which is this one. Oh, God, I can't see it. You like this one? Fractional reserve banking is inherently fraudulent. This required a certain amount of sophistication to actually know there is such a thing as fractional reserve banking. But let me assure you, since all of you bank at banks that use fractional reserves, it's not inherently fraudulent. But it did seem that some people, and I use Sarah Palin as a non-random example, seem to discover things about the banking system that have been known forever, but she didn't know. For example, that the Fed, which after all is a part of the government, has the awesome power to print money. If you're of her mindset and the mindset of others like that, that must be a bad thing. We've given this tremendous power to the state, but of course the Fed has had that power now for exactly 100 years. This is the centennial year of the founding of the Federal Reserve. But importantly, the backlash against the Fed did not only come from the ignorant, it also came from the smart. So Alan Meltzer, a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and John Taylor, a professor at Stanford, are hardly inexpert on monetary policy. They're in fact both very, very knowledgeable, both very, very expert. And look what they said in 2009, while things were still awful. The cure had not come close to working. And I think this was early 2009, but I don't know the month in which they penned this. So Alan Meltzer is saying that Ben Bernanke has squandered the independence of the Fed by working closely with the Treasury, not to mention with the Congress. As if what? As if the Fed should have shut the door on the Treasury and say, you know, we know we're in a crisis, but we're not talking to you guys because we're independent. And there's John Taylor saying correctly that the Fed is operating with a completely unprecedented policy regime, but then saying the Fed should get rid of that and go back to what it always does, even though the circumstances were circumstances nobody had seen ever, really. I mean, I wonder why they can say these things, but they did. So this is documenting, in a way, the very strong backlash against the Federal Reserve. Keynesian economics. Nixon, who I depicted earlier, once famously declared, we're all Keynesians now. That was right around 1970. Well, he was, I don't know if he was ahead or behind his time, but it's not true anymore. As The Economist observed in an article in 2011, if there's one ideology that unites today's Republicans, it is Keynesianism, whose nefarious influence they're determined to stamp out. An example of that is John Boehner's famous mantra, which he must have said 1,000 times in the years 2010, 2011, 2012, job-killing government spending. So this is another one like the Medicare phrase. I'll pause on this. Let's think about that. Job-killing government spending. So when the government spends money, what does it do? It may go to a private company and buy something, like wheels for an airplane or something. How does that kill jobs? Or it might do, oh my God, socialism, hire people onto its payrolls. How does that kill jobs? Now, there are more subtle answers under different economic circumstances, like the economy's already at full employment, so all you're going to do is push up interest rates, blah, blah, blah. We teach this to our students. When the stimulus was having its effects, the unemployment rate was 10% or so, and the Fed was going full out to push interest rates down as low as it could possibly do. None of those things apply. None of those subtleties apply. Government spending might have been excessive. I don't think so, but maybe. It might have been on the wrong things. It might have been inefficient. There are lots of things that you could criticize government spending in general, and the stimulus program in particular but not for killing jobs. Nonetheless, that was done. As anti-Keynesian an attitude as you could possibly have. I don't know about you, but I'm getting warm, so I'm going to take I'm warming up here. Take my jacket off. And of course, the budget deficit blew up dramatically. So this is a chart starting in 2007 and ending 2011 of the federal budget deficit by fiscal year. And Americans hate big deficits, or really, as I add after the dash, at the lip service level. Remember what I said earlier, Americans, if you ask them questions, they'll give you abstract questions, they tend to give you conservative answers. If you ask them pragmatic, programmatic questions, they tend to give you more liberal answers. Here's a very clear example of that. The Gallup poll in January 2011, after finding, of course, that the Americans hate the deficit and want it to be much smaller, asked a bunch of more specific questions like, would you like to reduce the deficit by cutting X? So when X was foreign aid, a majority of Americans said, sure, let's cut foreign aid. Foreign aid is about 1% of the federal budget. If you zeroed out foreign aid, you couldn't even see a difference in this graph. They look exactly the same. Aid to farmers? No. National defense? Well, no. Anti-poverty? No. Medicare? No. Social Security? Absolutely no. These are the folks that want the deficit to fall. This is what I mean by at the lip service level. They want and by the way, they don't want to pay more taxes either. I didn't even bother showing that. So they want the deficit to fall by magic. And that is indeed a popular position, which, by the way, puts politicians in a difficult spot. I said there was a backlash more generally against policy activism. That's a picture of a Tea Party. This is the quote from John Taylor, a snippet of it, repeated again. Here's one from Alan Greenspan, one of the people that was in an important position while a lot of the bad things were happening. One of the people I was alluding to before had a lot of regulatory authority that was not used. Greenspan said in a 2011 paper, the presumption that intervention can substitute for market flaws is itself highly doubtful. Much intervention turns out to hobble markets rather than enhancing them. Now, at some level, that's a true statement. You can do a lot of stupid things that mess up markets, but this was not an abstract statement. This was Greenspan speaking exactly about the reactions of the government to the crisis and arguing that they made it worse or better. And of course, you'll remember that Mitt Romney kindly said during the 2012 campaign that President Obama didn't cause the crisis. That was nice of him because it broke in 2008. Many Republicans said he did cause the crisis, by the way, but Romney didn't say that. But he made it worse. So by the stimulus and by the other things, according to the Romney campaign, President Obama and his friends made things worse rather than better. Now, so that's a documenting of the really severe backlash. There were reasons for this, so I want to go into what the Declaration of Independence would call legitimate grievances. So first of all, people had it rough. There were roughly 315 million innocent victims of this crisis. You know, I've often thought, and I don't know the number, how many people could, if we had a parade of the entire population of the United States, how many people could you pick out and say they were one of the causes? They were one of the villains of the piece. I don't know, 2,000, 3,000? It's not a million, and there are 315 million of us. So you had a lot of innocent victims from the frauds and near frauds in the mortgage markets, people who lost massive amounts. Well, first of all, you have to have wealth to lose wealth, but if you had wealth, you lost a lot of it. Most of this was in housing and stocks, and a rough estimate is about $18 trillion. For a reference, that's more than a year's GDP. Many people were victims of the terrible recession, including many who lost their jobs. And people thought, taxpayers, citizens thought that in their role as taxpayers, they were shouldering an enormous bill for the bailouts, for the bank bailouts. That simply wasn't true. The bank bailouts, in the end, were better than free. The government made a profit on the bank bailouts. I'll come back to that point later, but it was widely believed that we, the citizenry, had paid an awful lot to bail out the financial system. Secondly, you have the slump itself and its aftermath, which we're still living with. And it's probably the best known and best documented fact in political science is that a bad economy is bad for the incumbents when they run for election. And we see that time and time again. And it was. And as we remember, we're going to look back past the 2012 election. In the 2010 election, the Democrats were just totally routed. Had President Obama been up for re-election in 2010, he would have gone down to a resounding defeat, I'm sure. And the Congress did. A major problem here is that you can't prove a counterfactual. The counterfactual being, it was bad, but it would have been worse if we hadn't done these things. So here's a wonderful quotation from Barney Frank, former congressman from Massachusetts. No one has ever gotten re-elected where the bumper sticker said, "It would have been worse without me." You probably can get tenure with that, and by the way, you can. You can ask the dean over here. But you can't win office. And he had that exactly right. It goes deeper than that. Danny Kahneman has argued in this wonderful book of his, Thinking Fast and Slow, that what he calls whizziati is a normal feature of the way the human brain works. And whizziati is what you see is all there is. So apparently, when a saber-toothed tiger came around the corner, that's all you cared about. Run away from the saber-toothed tiger. Never mind a counterfactual, what if he wasn't there? What if there's a hole in the ground between me and him and the tiger falls in it? You ran away from the tiger. That says that it's really very, very difficult to get people even to think about counterfactual. Never mind believe them. Just even get their minds around a counterfactual. I think, by the way, that's what we bring people to universities to teach them. At least it's one of the reasons we bring them to universities. Then there was the matter of the bad guys. How many miscreants actually went to jail for this crisis? Well, I don't have an exact count, but I don't think I need all 5 fingers of one hand. Does anyone recognize this guy? I'm not expecting anybody will, nor after I give you his name will anybody. I believe this is the highest ranking financial official to go to jail for this crisis, and you never heard of him. He ran a small mortgage banking company that committed egregious frauds, and he and several of his colleagues from that firm wound up, I believe this is his jail wardrobe that we're seeing now. But that was about it. It is hard for me, and I think it's impossible for the American public to believe that nobody should have gone to jail for all this. That doesn't mean everybody should go to jail, far from it. But surely there was more fraud than that. And for reasons that I don't understand and will never understand, President Obama didn't really put an emphasis on this to the Justice Department until his 2012 State of the Union address. Remember, this happened in 2008. I just don't understand it. I'll never understand it. But I do know that a lot of people are angry. Fourth, explanations were scant. You heard hardly anything from President Bush, who was already almost a lame duck president when the bad stuff, not quite. It was September 2008 when the really bad stuff started happening. He was still president, but he was in the process of checking out. President Obama gave roughly one major speech. Now, he of course had to talk about it many times, with press conferences and so on, but in terms of gluing the nation to a television set while they watched the president in the Oval Office explain what this mess was about, once basically. That's not enough. Secretaries Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, Paulson for Bush and Geithner for Obama, were two very talented gentlemen. But among their talents was not the ability to deliver a good speech. Neither one. That's just a coincidence. It was an unfortunate coincidence, so you heard hardly anything. The financial markets and many people, and people that watch the financial press, heard a lot from both of these gentlemen, but the broad public heard very, very little. Now, of course, economists open their mouths many, many times, verbally, on paper, and so on, But let me assure you that nobody pays any attention to us. And the result then was massive confusion in the public. I just mentioned one, that the bank bailout cost a fortune. Huge misconceptions, like the stimulus didn't create any jobs. And really inchoate anger. The important word here is inchoate. Anger was very appropriate and even could have been functional in the reaction to this crisis. The Americans had a right to be angry about it. But you don't accomplish anything with that anger unless it's focused on a problem and helps get the problem solved. Like, for example, the political process is now trying to do with gun controls. I don't know if it's going to succeed, but it's focused on it. People are angry about what happened, and it's focused on getting something done. The anger about the financial crisis was not focused at all. It was more like the Howard Beale. I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take this anymore. Okay, what are you going to do, Howard? Then there was the bank bailout. This is a picture of Hank Paulson. The bank bailout, remember, was a Bush initiative. Let me preface this by saying the people were going to hate the bank bailout no matter what. All peoples in all countries where there have been bank bailouts have hated the bank bailouts. There was no way you were going to get Americans to like the bank bailouts. But there are degrees of loathing. And we came way high, and we could have been a lot lower if some things had been different. So, one, it would have been perfectly reasonable to attach public purpose strings to the money that the bankers were getting. These were loans. Said we weren't giving money, but we were lending money. Normally, you don't tell a banker how to do their job. As long as they're complying with the law, do what you want. But when you're getting public money, the public has a right to expect something in return, and Mr. Paulson asked nothing of them. Secondly, the deal that was made gave too little upside to the taxpayers. It did give upside to the taxpayers, but to take a non-random example, Warren Buffett had shortly before made a deal with Goldman Sachs that, what do you know, gave him more upside than the Paulson deal gave to the U.S. taxpayer. That's just an example. The bank bailout had minimal restrictions, not zero, but very minimalist restrictions on banks paying dividends or paying large bonuses to their executives. Not nothing, there were some, but it wasn't very much, and it was deliberate. Paulson didn't believe that that was a smart thing to do. Tim Geithner, by the way, when he became Secretary of the Treasury, did tighten the executive compensation restrictions. Still, they were hardly draconian, but tighter. Then I alluded to this before. Back at the time of the bank bailout, one of the things that might have been a public purpose string is foreclosure mitigation. Don't foreclose on so many people. Or, as we learned much later, at least foreclose legally. We didn't know about that in 2008, but there was basically nothing there to prevent the tsunami of foreclosures, which was entirely predictable. And then, very unfortunately, and completely detached from the equities of the case, like which was the better policy, Paulson gave the TARP put a political albatross around the TARP's necks by pursuing the following bait and switch, what looked like bait and switch policy. With great difficulty, he, Bernanke, and others argued the TARP through the Congress, and after failing once, got a positive vote. The Congress thought it was buying troubled assets, TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program. So let's see, what do you think a Troubled Assets Relief Program does? It maybe relieves troubled assets, maybe by buying something, some of them by the government, or lending to other people who will then buy them, get them off the bank's balance sheets. That's what the law said, by the way. Instead, about a month into the life of the TARP, Secretary Paulson announced he was not, first of all, he didn't buy any troubled assets. Then about a month later, he announced, I'm not going to buy any troubled assets with the Troubled Assets Relief Program. This is not very good politics. And this is wholly apart from whether you think or don't think that the use to which Paulson did put the money, which is buying stock in banks, preferred stock basically, was smart or dumb. One can argue that. Smarter or dumber than buying troubled assets. One can argue that. That's not what I'm talking about. There's something, you're looking for political trouble when you promise A and you do B. And he got political trouble. As I mentioned, the banking part of the TARP has turned a nice profit, but people don't know that. Then there was the backlash against the Fed that I mentioned. People said that the Fed overstepped its authority. Some of them said it overstepped its legal authority. That's clearly wrong. The Fed stayed within the law. But proper authority is a more political, good government notion than legal authority. The legal was a red herring. So what were some of the key issues? The Fed lent massive amounts to the Americans' banks. That's what central banks do in crises. They're lenders of last resort, but nobody had ever seen a magnitude like this. This was an incredible amount of lending. At its peak, I believe it was $1.5 trillion with a T, dollars. Before the crisis, Federal Reserve lending to banks, I believe, was about 200 million with an M dollars. So this was pretty unusual to go to $1.5 trillion. Then it lent to non-banks. I mean, central banks started to say it lent to banks, but it also lent to non-banks, which is extremely unusual. It bought what I'm politely calling here unusual assets. Some people used other adjectives to describe some of the assets that the Fed bought, for example, from Bear Stearns, things that Jamie Dimon didn't want to expose his taxpayers to the risk of, his stockholders, shareholders to the risk. The government took them instead. And there were other things like that. And deciding which financial institution should live or die, which is not a business the central bank is normally in. So as we know, the decisions went Bear Stearns, sort of. Fannie and Freddie, well, sort of nationalized. AIG sort of nationalized. Lehman hit the bankruptcy court. Things like that. Quite extraordinary things for the Fed to do. I already mentioned but here the seventh reason in legitimate grievances, the huge government budget deficits. I won't go back into that again. And then I come to the question that I think historians will be debating for 100 years or more, which is, and I presume that during that 100 years the answer will switch. Yes, no, yes, no. Did President Obama take on too many things at once? My answer is yes. And I won't be around for 100 years to see how this changes. Let me just remind you of a few things he had to do. Cauterize the bleeding financial system. It was still open and bleeding when he became president of the United States. Stimulate aggregate demand. That was the stimulus program because people weren't spending. Obviously, we had to reform the financial system because there must have been many things wrong with it to lead to an outcome such as we got, and there were. Call those the mandatories, as they say in figure skating. Then there's the optionals, all of which he said yes to. Do you want to reform healthcare delivery while we're doing this? Yes. Do you want to tackle the global climate change problem with cap and trade or something like that? He answered yes. How about wholesale reform of the educational system? Yes. And ... There were other things. This was a lot of stuff, and I'm not even putting on the list the fact that there were 2 wars going on, not counting the so-called war on terrorism, the fight against Al-Qaeda, things going on in Pakistan and in the Middle East, and on and on. It was a lot on the plate of an inexperienced politician. It was a lot on the plate of anybody. This would have been a lot for Franklin Roosevelt or Abe Lincoln. So the consequences is that the Obama administration violated the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. It was not simple. There was not a clear focus in the way that Bill Clinton focused in his transition by saying, I'm going to focus like a laser beam on the economy. And there wasn't a clear strategy. People didn't know really what the president stood for, what his priorities were, because everything is not an answer for that. Everything can't be your priority. So I'm answering yes to this question, and history will deal with this many, many times. To finish up, here's my 7-step rehab program for policymakers. And the reason I do this is the worry that I expressed early on. There will be other instances, hopefully not as bad as this one, where the government has to do extraordinary things, many of which are counterintuitive. And can we do this without getting into such a deep, without eliciting such a deep backlash? Step 1, don't try to do too many big things at once. This follows right on from that previous slide. There were 3 very different reasons for this. The first is a constitutional problem. James Madison, when he wrote the Constitution, meant to make it hard to do anything. That was deliberate. It's not an accident. That's the basis of our republic. And it follows from that, of course, that to do a whole lot of things in a short period of time is really much more difficult here than it is, say, in a parliamentary democracy with a strong majority, right? A new prime minister if a new prime minister of Britain gets elected, or any of the parliamentary majorities with a strong majority, he can ram through about 35 big things in the first week of office because the parliament's a rubber stamp. No one of either party will object to me saying, our Congress is not a rubber stamp. Whatever, I don't know what it is, but it's not a rubber stamp. This is compounded by the partisanship problem, which is extreme. It's not like we've never had severe partisanship in the United States of America before. We have. I'm not convinced that it's worse now than it was for Hamilton and Jefferson, for example. But it's waxed and waned, that through most of the post-war period, post-World War II period, there was vastly less partisanship in the Congress than there is today. And that makes it, so layer that on top of Madison's design and you've really got troubles. And then there's the bandwidth problem. This goes to the KISS principle that I mentioned before. People just get lost in information overload, even if one side is not deliberately distorting the truth for partisan reasons, but of course that's going on also. These are some of the reasons for my yes answer in that earlier slide. Step 2, explain yourself to the people. I don't understand why President Obama didn't explain over and over again to Americans, this is how we got into this mess. Here's what we propose to do to fix the problems. We do have a coherent plan, and here, let me explain to you why it makes sense. And please be patient, we're not going to fix this overnight. Why that wasn't said clearly, I will never know. I will go to my grave not understanding that one. And of course, you have to say it in plain language that people can understand. Politicians are good at that. Economists, by the way, aren't. Step 4, repeat steps 2 and 3. We here in the academy hate to repeat ourselves. It's like the cardinal sin for an academic is to repeat yourself. You can say silly things, that's okay, as long as they seem original and you haven't said them yesterday. Dean Ross is laughing at this because she knows how true it is. But in the political world, if you want to get the people with you, remember the Geithner statement, we kind of lost the people? You have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until it sinks in. They didn't. Step 5, set expectations low. 2 reasons for this. First of all, I mentioned that progress is going to be slow if you're dealing with a big, complicated problem, and they were. But secondly, and maybe just as important, there is no punishment for doing better than you forecast, and severe political punishment for doing worse. Now, in academia, punishment, so to speak, is symmetric. Like you say this is going to happen and you err in one direction or another, and it's kind of symmetric. But in the political world, it's not symmetric at all. I'm a living, breathing example of that. Let me give you a short confession. At the beginning of the Clinton administration, and I mean the beginning, the first day of the Clinton administration, we in the economic team had to produce a forecast for 5 years, an economic forecast for 5. Now they do 10. And we used to do this sort of mythical budgeting in 5-year increments then, that we now do in 10-year increments. We had to do that because without that, the Office of Management and Budget can't even start their computers moving to generate a budget proposal. The forecast, so what makes this a personal suggestion, I was in charge at the Council of Economic Advisors. I was the captain of the team that produced that forecast, which you can find, if you want to, in the Economic Report of the President, 1994, and in the budget that the Obama administration put out in its early months. That was a horrible forecast. Way, way off base on every variable, all in the same direction. The economy did vastly better than what our forecast has said, what our forecast at the time said. We didn't have the chutzpah to forecast what actually was going to happen in the United States in the years 94, 95, 96, 97, 98. Remember, you may remember those years. They were pretty good. So the forecast was terrible. The number of people in my life that have, so this is 93, that have come up to me and said, you know, Blinder, you should be ashamed of that terrible forecast, is zero. Zero. Nobody has. On the other hand, you can ask Christy Romer, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors at the beginning of the Obama administration, how many people have complained to her about the terrible forecast. There's a titanic asymmetry here. Step 6, and I'm almost remember it was a 7-step program, so I'm just about finished. Pay close attention to people's attitudes, prejudices, and misconceptions. They have plenty of prejudices and misconceptions. But there's a saying in retailing, the customer is always right. Now, they're not always right, actually. Sometimes the customer comes in and they're being ridiculous, completely ridiculous. But a good retailer and a good retail politician sort of treats them as if they're always right, or at least explains to them better. And finally, since this went fast, I want to go back. So that said pay close attention. This says pay rapt attention. Rapt attention to fairness, because unlike in the world that economists live in, where efficiency is often the crucial thing, in the general public and in the political world, fairness almost always matters more than anything else. And of course, the people did not feel that they were getting treated fairly in this episode. Last slide. Well, I would say you know who this is, but his name is right up there. Rahm Emanuel famously said actually I think this was in the Obama transition, when he was the chief of staff designate rather than the chief of staff, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And so the question I think that we're still grappling with is, did we? And my answer is, let's hope we didn't let it go to waste. Thank you. And the rule is to give preference to students, which I see as being taken care of. Princeton students get to go first. Whoops, I didn't.
Thank you so much for the talk. I
Welcome.
wanted to ask what you thought the legacy or the efficacy of some of the policies that did result in financial crisis, such as Dodd-Frank and Basel III or Green talks about international regulatory reform have accomplished or not accomplished.
Well, the international part, so I'll be very brief on that, is still a work in progress. There is a great need for international cooperation and homogenization of some, but not all, financial regulation. Very little has happened in that regard so far. They're working on it. I wouldn't be that optimistic. I wouldn't be very, very much more optimistic than I generically am about international cooperation. Nation states do what's in their own interest for the most part, and only occasionally can you get them to deviate. America has run ahead of most of the rest of the world in terms of financial reform. The Dodd-Frank Act is a big deal. It's often ridiculed because it's 2,319 pages long. But the reason it's that long is that there's an awful lot in it. It's not just a couple of things. There's a huge number of changes in the way we regulate, the way we structure the financial system, and so on. I think it's a pretty good bill. I'd give it a BB+, which in the kind of world in which that was hatched, right? The partisanship did not disappear. There wasn't a truce. They say, okay, let's forget about partisanship for a while and pass Dodd-Frank, and then we'll go back to partisanship. That was not the way it was done. Given that reality, I think they got quite a lot done. And while nobody should think that Dodd-Frank is going to abolish, or I would even say reduce the frequency of financial bubbles, which is one of the things that got us into this mess, I think there are many, many reasons, and I'll just mention two, to think it will make the consequences less severe when bubbles burst. So I said I'll just mention two. One is the what's called orderly, so the adverb is crucial, orderly liquidation authority. What does that gibberish term mean? It means we should never have to do what we did with Lehman Brothers. Okay, we had this big mess on our hands, and we just threw it over the side of the ship and say, let the courts deal with this. Didn't work out very well. We now have in Dodd-Frank, Title I, I think, might be Title II, an elaborate system for euthanizing gently the next too big to fail institution that comes down the line looking like it's going to fail. What happened to Lehman was not gentle in any way at all. And what happened to AIG, say, was very different. It was basically nationalized. Two bad alternatives. Under the Dodd-Frank, there's a better alternative, which is to put these institutions to bed slowly and gently under the arms of the FDIC, as sort of as happens when small banks go under. You can't quite do that because they're much more complicated. The other thing that's in Dodd-Frank, the other thing I want to mention is that, believe it or not, we had no systemic financial regulator in the United States, none. What I mean by that is there was no agency of the United States government that had a responsibility for watching the entire financial landscape, looking for troubles. They were all looking in their own silos. So there were banks, there were investment banks, there were mortgage banks, there were insurance companies, there were broker-dealers. They all had their regulators, well, sort of. Some of them hardly had any regulation. But there were stop signs for the regulators when they started to venture out of their own bailiwick. And so, just to give you a concrete example, when many, many bad mortgages started being written, some of them in banks, but a lot of them in non-banks, the banking regulators really didn't see the whole picture. They should have, but they didn't. That kind of a thing shouldn't happen anymore. And of course, there are a zillion other things in Dodd-Frank. So I think in general it's a good bill. Does anyone have a piece of paper? Someone's going to ask me a question, I'm going to have to write something down. It might be you. Go ahead.
I had short enough that I had to last. You mentioned that you thought that the Obama administration and Congress tried to do too much when they were elected. And I think, there's something to that. But what could they have, in an ideal world, instead of doing healthcare reform, what could they have done after they had completed the first stimulus in 2009. They probably weren't going to just do another stimulus right away.
No.
So what do you think they should have done and could have done?
Well, I think we could have gotten more deeply into bank reform or financial reform faster. That bill passed in summer of 2010. That's not so bad, but it probably could have been done faster. I think there were a lot of things that probably could have been done or worked on about the future of the budget. That's come back to haunt us. We certainly didn't want to start cutting the budget in the worst of the recession. I don't think we want to cut it anymore now, frankly. But, I mean, to give you a concrete example, which was not touched, many of us, this is not an idiosyncratic view to me, think that in terms of reform, Social Security is the low-hanging fruit. It's not that hard. The magnitudes are not that large. You don't have to do anything horrific to get it back into actuarial balance. And that might have taken some of the political heat off the long-run budget deficit. So I think that probably would have been a good thing to do. Much as I love cap and trade, well, like most economists, I like carbon taxes even better. Seems to me you were just looking for political trouble by bringing that into the play, what with all the other things going on. So those are a few examples. Oh, and then I did mention, maybe we could have prosecuted a few crooks.
I thought that was a great question. I just want to follow up. In your presentation, you suggested that we should explore counterfactuals. So I guess I'd like to push you on your counterfactual. What do you imagine would have happened if instead of pursuing healthcare, they had pursued those other agenda items? Do you think that, setting aside the question of prosecution or better communication or Geithner giving better speeches, and do you think Democrats would have won, and then won in 2010? Would Democrats have won in 2010? And do you believe that outweighs the benefits of the 41 million insured and under healthcare?
No, you raise a really good question that I wonder about a lot, and I think history will wonder about a lot, and probably my guess has come down on Obama's side. Because while healthcare was, in a sense, extraneous to the big problems we were dealing with, it was like, so explain to me how healthcare reform is going to create more jobs. It wasn't going to, really. It is the fact that he got it. See, unlike the climate change, it is the fact that he got it where Harry Truman couldn't get it, Lyndon Johnson couldn't get it. Well, Lyndon Johnson got Medicare and so on. Many Democratic presidents have tried. Bill Clinton couldn't get it, and he succeeded. And so I think you have to give a huge weight to that. So it's by no means obvious that it was it's far from obvious that it was a poor decision to go for health care since he won it. Now, if you talk to a lot of the people in the administration or that have left the administration, and we'll talk about it, many of them have said this just so occupied the administration that it had to just give up many, many other things that it needed to do to sell this program, make it work, the economic program, to make it work, and so on. I take them at their word. Would that have, so I think then the backlash would have been less. I think I was careful to say when I was speaking before, they would have had it anyway because a bad economy is going to be bad for the incumbents. So I think there would have been losses by the Democrats in the 2010 election. Probably not as severe, but significant. It's sort of kind of an economy that they were running against. So when you weigh that, I think it's quite possible to come down to the verdict that, he was smart to do health care. It did cost on the one side in these things, but you did have the health care bill as a huge success and as part of the legacy of this administration. So I think that's my answer.
So it seems to me that something that characterizes the implementation of Dodd-Frank is delay and missed deadlines. I think I read that almost 2/3 of deadlines for rulemaking requirements in Dodd-Frank have been missed. I was wondering if you have any insight into why this is taking longer to be implemented, what's going on with the regulatory agencies in terms of making deadlines.
I do. There are several things. First of all, the workload that Dodd-Frank assigned to a number of these regulatory agencies was enormous, and probably, at least in parts, impossible to do within the designated timeframes. The law does generally give timeframes. You have to do this by such a date and so on. As you say, a lot of those deadlines have been missed. So part of it was just unrealistic expectations of how much the regulatory bodies could accomplish. But that was exacerbated by an unwillingness of the Congress, this is mostly the Republicans in the Congress, to appropriate enough money so that they could get more staff. You might say, well, why don't you just hire more people to do this stuff? They couldn't, so they didn't have enough resources, they didn't have enough staff. The lobbying by the financial industry has been and continues to be extensive, powerful, and highly effective. They're not winning everything. But I should digress slightly. The way laws are made in the United States, even when they're 2,319 pages long, they're basically a framework. And the details get filled in by regulation writing, by the regulatory agencies. So that was back to the first part of your answer. There was a huge amount of that needed to be done. And that's where the industry lobbyists are really effective. That's one of the places they're really effective. Get it written a little bit more favorable to us, a little bit less strict, and so on. And sometimes just delay it. Just delay it. And there's a lot of that that's gone on, and it's still going on to this day. Yes, sir.
Looking down the road, I'm concerned about inflation. I'm wondering if you are, and if not, why not?
Okay, fair question. I'm not. Now, depends how far down the road. Eventually, I'm not. So let me be a little more specific. If you mean inflation within the next 2-3 years, I'm not at all concerned. If you mean a decade, 20 years from now, first of all, it's who knows. I'm not. So you're right in the middle. Right in the harder part. In that kind of framework, whether we're going to have inflation as one of the legacies of this crisis, or more properly, one of the legacies of the policies promulgated to fight the crisis, we're talking about Federal Reserve policies now, is how well or poorly the Federal Reserve executes what's being called its exit strategy. So what do I mean by that? What does it have to exit from? First of all, the Fed has pushed its own interest rate to zero, almost to zero, and in the process pulled a lot of interest rates. All short-term rates are very close to zero, and long-term rates are very low. When the Fed, as we return to normal, those things have to go up. And if they don't go up fast enough, we're going to start getting into an overheated economy, which is where you get inflation. That, by the way, is why I say in the next 2-3 years, I'm not worried about that. We're not going to be facing an overheated economy. The other thing from which it has to exit is the unusual balance sheet that it now owns. Both by size, it's about 3 times what it was at the start of the crisis, because the Fed has bought a lot of stuff to create liquidity, and in composition. So the Fed, for example, this is the biggest example, now owns about $1 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. I think you probably all know how many it owned before the crisis. 0. So this is not something the Fed really wants to have in its portfolio. It wasn't an accident. It was done to support the mortgage market, which had basically died. So the Fed, first of all, has to change the composition, and secondly, will it be simultaneous? Shrink the balance sheet eventually, not now. And if it goes too slow on that, as the financial system starts returning to normal, there will be excessive liquidity, there will be excessive lending, money supply growth, spending, and so on, and that's how you get inflation. out of it. I hasten to point out, though, every time I ask this question, is the Fed could also err in the other direction, which is exactly what it did in 1937. It could start withdrawing the incredible liquidity too soon before the economy is ready to walk without crutches, and then it won't be inflation, that's our worry, it'll be deflation, which is, of course, exactly what happened in the 1930s. I think we've got pretty good people at the Fed. They're not miracle workers. They won't get this exactly right. I'm not even sure I could define what exactly right means. But let's define exactly right as the inflation rate 5 to 7 years from now is 2%. That's the Fed's target. I could imagine that the inflation rate 5 to 7 years from now is 1 or 2 percentage points lower than that, or 1 or 2 percentage points higher than that, because the Fed doesn't get it exactly right. You have to believe deeply in an incompetence in the Federal Reserve that I don't see to think we're going to come out of this with 10% inflation, 15% inflation, or anything remotely like that.
Yeah, my question is also about monetary policy. So there's a lot of political pressure during the aftermath of the crisis that prevented Congress and the President from doing some of the things they could have done in reaction. But the Federal Reserve really didn't have some of that. Couldn't they have done more in terms of monetary policy to alleviate the problems of doing drastic measures like price level targeting?
You mean, why didn't it do more drastic things? Is that
Could it have, or what?
Could it have? Yes, it could have had. We have a very smart former Princeton professor making decisions about what is wise to do and what is unwise to do. So first of all, they brought the short-term interest rate to zero. Pretty much everybody was on board on that. If at that point you come to a fork in the road and one fork says don't do anymore, that's all you can do, he was not going to take that. And the other fork is called unconventional monetary policy, some of the things you mentioned. On that fork in the road, the two things that Ben Bernanke and the Fed have focused on are, first of all, what's called forward guidance. This is what used to be called open mouth policy. This is actually giving, I was going to say hints, very strong hints of what the Fed intends to do in the future in order to hold down long-term interest rates, saying basically, we're not raising those short-term interest rates for a long, long time. So long-term interest rates should stay low. He's a believer in that. And the second thing is what I was speaking about a moment ago, blowing up the balance sheet, buying a lot of stuff, creating huge amounts of bank reserves that unfortunately are mainly just sitting in banks. Now, if you ask Ben Bernanke about that, what he'll say is don't look at the liability side of the Fed balance sheet where you find the reserves. Look at the asset side. We bought all these MBS, we bought all these treasuries, and that's pulling interest rates down. And those are the two things that he's decided to emphasize, he and the committee. There are other things. So you mentioned, I think, price level targeting, which they've not done, which arguably is a stronger insurance policy against deflation. Some people are pushing towards nominal GDP targeting, which is a second cousin of price level targeting. I have been urging the Federal Reserve for 3 years now to persuade banks to get rid of some of those excess reserves they're just sitting on by stop paying interest on them, or better yet, charge them for that. I've tried to persuade Ben Bernanke of this several times. I've not succeeded. So there are other things that the Fed could do.
So I was going to have you.
Let's let the dean intervene.
So just because it's getting short on time and we see that there are still 4 questions, I'm going to ask you each to ask your questions before Professor Winder responds. Okay?
Okay.
So on that,
I'm sorry, just 2 at a time, all 4.
yes, right. So on that topic, just because you just said that, I'd be curious, what is his argument for paying interest on reserves? But what I was going to ask is, in terms of targeting, the Fed took a somewhat unexpected step of essentially saying they're doing something akin to, and not exactly unemployment targeting, that they're going to keep rates down until we get an unemployment rate of 6.5 or other things happen. What prompted that? Why didn't they do that before?
Okay.
So how do we bring financial regulatory reform back on the agenda? By all accounts, we're talking about the budget now. Immigration is next. It's not really on anyone's radar screen. And short of another crisis, it just doesn't seem like we want to reopen the Dodd-Frank type debate.
Yeah, that's a good question. Go ahead. I'm going to answer them all staccato.
How has the risk of the Fed's portfolio changed over these past 3
Speak a little louder, please.
How has the risk of the Fed's portfolio changed over the past couple of years, and what are the implications of that?
Last one. Yes, sir.
This is more about regulation. There has been some talk about going back to Glass-Steagall. How do you feel about that?
Okay. All right, now some of these deserve much longer answers than I'm going to give them, but I'm going to try to be really fast. The focus on getting the unemployment rate down to 6.5% and going lower is the latest version of forward guidance. All of them are variants on the same theme, which is trying to tell the markets the short-term interest rate is going to be super low for longer than you think. And that's supposed to work on the yield curve. The interest on reserves, Bernanke argues that it's not such a powerful instrument, which everybody agrees with. They don't have any powerful instruments, so I don't think that's a very good argument. And they also used to argue, and to some extent still do, but it's getting increasingly silly, that the main effect of that would be to drive short-term interest rates to zero. Well, short-term interest rates are zero, basically. That had a lot more coherence. That seemed to be a more cogent argument 3 years ago than it does today. How do we get financial reform back on the agenda? Man, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm afraid that this is now in the hands of the insiders, not the outsiders. We need outside pressure with all the other distractions, and because the issues in financial reform, most of them are so arcane that I have no idea how you can actually marshal public opinion. And as a counterweight to the bank lobbying, and the bank lobbyists think that's just wonderful. So I don't have an answer to that, but you are right to point to it as a significant problem. The Fed's portfolio is very substantially riskier than it was before the crisis, when basically all it owned was treasury bills. I exaggerate only slightly, but safer than it was in the early days of the crisis. I mentioned the dodgy Bear Stearns assets that Jamie Dimon wouldn't buy for JP Morgan. The Fed's rid of those. The Fed was tremendously exposed on AIG, but the Treasury basically took it off the hook on that, and now AIG has paid back. So apart from interest rate risk, the Fed is going to suffer, like all bondholders, significant losses when interest rates go up. The Fed is now holding pretty safe stuff. Even these MBS that I mentioned too, before they're Fannie and Freddie MBS, Fannie and Freddie are nationalized companies, so it's basically Treasury debt, very safe. And the last question was about Glass-Steagall. I was wondering when that would come. Glass-Steagall is a bugbear. So for those of you who aren't into this, the operational part of Glass-Steagall was the separation of investment banking from commercial banking in 1935? Three. And the breaking down of that barrier, the abrogation of that law in 1999. When people, and that gets a lot of blame from some people for the crisis. When people do that, I challenge them to find me things that couldn't have been done without breaking down this barrier that led to real troubles. You don't find much. The troubles came from banks doing banking very badly. It came from investment banks doing investment banking very badly. And when I start naming the names, you'll see that most of them had nothing to do with Glass-Steagall. There was Bank of America, there was Merrill Lynch, there was Goldman Sachs, not a bank. I mean, a bank in name only. It's a BINO now, a bank in name only. There was Lehman Brothers, investment bank, and so on. You had a lot of bad things going on in pure banks, you had a lot of bad things going on in pure investment banks, and you really had a lot of bad things going on in the so-called shadow banking system, which has basically nothing to do with Glass-Steagall. The only coherent answer that ever comes back to that challenge is, what about Citigroup? Citigroup was the merger of a big insurance company called Travelers with a big bank called Citibank. What problem did Travelers Insurance cause to anybody? None that I know. I'm not one of their policyholders, so maybe they did something, but they were not the root of this. And furthermore, it defies banking history, this is a counterfactual again, to say America would have gone through this horrible banking ruction without Citigroup getting into trouble. Citi has always been in the center, or near the center, of every banking problem we've had in America in this century.